So our last speaker today for this particular panel is Clarissa Hard, who is a third-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge, where she also completed her undergraduate and master's degrees. Her thesis focuses on the relationships between physicality and the imagination in the works of Thomas Hardy, D.H. Lawrence, and Philip Larkin. Today she's going to talk about Anglican churches and Larkin's ambivalent attitude towards religion and spirituality.
For many people, the name Philip Larkin will summon to mind carefully observed depictions of everyday life, a concrete sense of place, and a no-nonsense, at times lugubrious, voice of reason. Given his staunch rejection of faith and this reputation for clear-sighted realism, it is perhaps surprising that Larkin was drawn to places of worship and religious ritual. Taken together, his letters, poems, and photographs bespeak an enduring interest in ecclesiastical spaces, especially when abandoned or empty, and some of these depict the church as a monolithic cultural institution, mourning its decline in an increasingly secular post-war England. Why, then, did the man who claimed that religion was a vast, moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die, gravitate to religious places and take their significance so seriously? In this presentation, I will explore the appeal of Anglican churches, a curiously charged space for Larkin and so many others, analyse what he calls the marvellous blent air of these sacred spaces, and then consider this in relation to his work more broadly. What kind of spiritual hunger did these churches satisfy for so long? And what happens to that hunger in the absence of a belief system? I should make clear, I'm not discussing a religious belief so much as a religious attitude, the metaphysical impulse to reach beyond oneself, put one's own life in dialogue with history, and feel humble before the unknown. Larkin described himself as an Anglican atheist, sometimes agnostic, but mostly atheist, often tempering his dismissal of faith with a certain affection for the social, cultural, and aesthetic value of the Church of England. Reading Letters to Monica the other day, I was struck by the number of references to sacred music, the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible, and different church services Larkin either attended or tuned into on the radio, such as choral evensong, a symbol of rest and retirement, as he called it. This stance has literary precedent. Indeed, three of the main literary figures in Larkin's life, W.B. Yeats, Thomas Hardy, and D.H. Lawrence, ultimately rejected Christian doctrine, but never renounced their interest in Christianity. As Lawrence commented, churches put us in touch with the utterly illimitable depth and breadth of the unknown. They give us a tantalizing glimpse into the beyond, even if this beyond is indeed a fictional construct. Hardy and Lawrence in particular gravitated to the physical space of Anglican churches. Hardy trained as an architect and specialized in church restoration, while many of his poems grapple with the preservation of memory over time, often focusing on gravestones and churches. Likewise, Lawrence was captivated by what he called the stupendous emotional gesture of the cathedrals, where a blind collective impulse rose into concrete form. He discusses this most clearly in the study of Thomas Hardy, from which both of these quotations are taken. Following in these footsteps, Larkin was drawn to the physical manifestations of worship, whether religious architecture or the rites associated with churchgoing. Even the act of entering a church as a detached observer and taking in the environment with an anthropological eye has a particular appeal. As he said to Betjeman in the famous Monitor television programme in 1964, "I like going into them. I know very little about them, but I always welcome the feeling I have going into a church, and in the end, I began to try to write about it." Perhaps more than any other poem in Larkin's work, the great humanist poem Churchgoing depicts the church as a spiritual home for many over the centuries and a formative moral and cultural institution in England, while never seriously contemplating the possibility of God's existence. While there is the occasional calculated sign of awkward reverence in the speaker's comportment, The carelessness of letting the door thud shut behind him and immediately referring to God as a colloquial figure of speech, God knows how long, punctures any sense of the truly sacred, I think. In the introduction to the 1962 New Lines anthology, Al Alvarez criticised the so-called flatness of these opening lines, which depict, and I quote, the post-war welfare state Englishman. He is just like the man next door. In fact, he probably is the man next door. Why there is anything wrong with representing the man next door, Alvarez does not address. As Larkin explained to Monica in 1954, the cultivation of this persona was far from inadvertent. He establishes an atmosphere of detached skepticism in order to qualify this attitude later in the poem, depicting a young heathen stumbling across a church by chance and surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious. As this man next door contemplates the special shell, now empty of worshippers, he considers the uncertain future threatening churches in an increasingly secular England. He envisages a tourist trail, monetizing a defunct religion, then superstitious individuals who visit once the general public has lost interest. After this, however, he gives full weight to the pun in his title, and indeed the title of this talk. But superstition, like belief, must die, and what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. Given that the speaker is supposedly bored, uninformed, the sense of loss here is surprising. The tone is wistful, mourning the decline of a belief system that gave structure to human impulses and opinions, if only to kick against it in disbelief. It's still an age-old way of framing and ritualizing thoughts and values, and ultimately it's something that people loved, and the destruction of that will always be painful. We shift from the quiet animation of matting, seats and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small, neat organ, to the disorder of grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a line that seems to tumble out. The reader is invited to visualize a carefully tended, almost domestic scene, only to demolish the ideological and physical shape of this image. The homely parish church is replaced by nothing but wilderness. The sense of waste is stoked by the imminence of destruction too, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. The church is slipping away from the speaker and altering the very fabric of England as he knows it. From the penultimate stanza onwards, Larkin begins to rebuild this frowsty barn, leading up to the final stanza. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. After referring to this place for what it was, a serious house on serious earth it is pulls us back to the present tense and resurrects the church. By summoning a mental image, asking us to destroy it, and then restoring it at the last moment, we are left with a sense of familiarity. A foray into the less recognizable and more obscure ends with a homecoming, and a satisfying sense of symmetry wraps up the poem. There is certainly the implication of delusion in the poem. Churchgoers place themselves within a cosmic order, gravitating to a space in which it is safe for their compulsions to meet and be transformed. The word compulsions seems to gesture towards the irrational. It all feels rather convenient to place these within a theological framework and make them feel like destinies. Nevertheless, Larkin believed that church-going speaks to a deeply human instinct to transcend oneself and partake in a socially integrated purpose. Recalling the abandoned church in Belfast that first inspired church-going in 1953, Larkin wrote, "It made a deep impression on me. I had seen plenty of bombed churches, but never one that had simply fallen into disuse. And for a few minutes, I felt the decline of Christianity in our century as tangibly as gooseflesh." Later on, in a 1981 interview, Larkin explained, "I'd never seen a ruined church before, discarded. It shocked me. Now, of course, it's commonplace. Churches are not so much ruined as turned into bingo halls, warehouses for the refrigerators, or split-level houses for architects. This heartfelt response seems to complicate the image of Larkin as a cynical atheist, scoffing at specious stuff as he does no bard, positing religion as a vast, moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die. Or else the mass hysteria in faith healing, where the congregation is stiff, twitching and loud with deep hoarse tears, thinking a voice at last calls them alone. It is perhaps worth noting that faith healing is about an evangelical faith healing ceremony led by an American priest, so not exactly the kind of church that would appeal to Larkin's Protestant soul, as he once described it to Monica. John Osborne elucidates. Larkin's own position was fairly categorical. He once said, "I am an atheist," an Anglican atheist, of course. But in a number of poems, he does want the church to continue its social rites and observances. He believed these institutions provided social cement in a disintegrative age. The church is, or rather was, an emblem of stability, imposing structure and meaning on the entropy of our lives. This is true in terms of how it structures time, the cyclical calendar of the church year, the time and length of evensong, the repetition of ritual. These are all ways of demarcating and indeed understanding time, whether that's in a year or a day. These buildings are a way for us to orient ourselves in history. The church also regulates physical space. It designates certain activities and even types of thinking to a particular shared space. Churches become a reference point against which we define our physical and psychic landscapes and make sense of our collective past. They help to define and affirm a sense of national identity, culture, and community, even to the extent that an atheist in post-war England was automatically an Anglican atheist, of course. More importantly, though, churches provide a space in which worshippers can visit a world that bears the mark of infinity, as Gaston Bachelard put it. Whether this world actually exists or not, well, we shall find out. The private is put into conversation with the communal, the individual with a higher sense of purpose, and we are brought together in an otherwise atomized age. This is still an ongoing human need. As Larkin points out in the final stanza, that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious and gravitating with it to this ground. We certainly get a sense of the beyond in church-going, or at least the intense human yearning for the beyond. The atmosphere of this church is not merely an extension of the physical world outside, but has a particular charge of its own. Discussing his poem to Monica in 1954, Larkin famously described the church as a place where people came to be serious, were always serious, and all their different forms of seriousness came to be intermingled, so that a christening reminded of a funeral and a funeral of a wedding. Nowadays, these things happen in different buildings, and the marvelous blent air of a church is growing rarer. In these descriptions, the physical space of the church seems to operate by different temporal rules, united and regulated by space. In this letter, and indeed the final stanza, there is a particular blent air made up of different forms of seriousness intermingling in and across the ages. Blent belongs to Hardy's idiolect. Yeats also employs the word, but usually in a more romantic or interpersonal context. It seems that our two natures blent, and so forth. The word is rich with implication in Larkin's usage. It designates a unifying force to the air of the church, bringing together what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. There is a striking conflation between physical space and the passage of time, especially in the last two stanzas. Physically, congregations are brought together in and across time. This consecrated earth is marked out as a cross of ground demarcated from everyday life. The church is reimagined as a vessel, a special shell which held unspilt so long and equably not only the physical rites associated with marriage, birth, and death, but even thoughts of these. In this particular environment, thoughts seem to manifest themselves physically and imbue the air with their memory, so much so that the air takes on a tangible quality. Perhaps this contributes to the tense, musty, unignorable silence Larkin refers to in the first stanza. There's a liquidity to this imagery too. Unspilt and equably portray the collective time spent inside the church as liquid, shapeless, and fluid, unless held by the building, which is characterized by solidity and architectural structure: house, barn, ground, earth, even shell. We find a similar kind of physicality in an Arundel tomb, where nearby sound and light take on a tactile quality. A litter of bird calls strewed the same bone-riddled ground. Light each summer thronged the glass, and even air changes to soundless damage. The entombed Earl and Countess also travel on a supine stationary voyage through the centuries. Rigidly, they persisted, linked through lengths and breadths of time. Time here becomes a medium through which they travel, like air or liquid. Liquid is a more accurate image, I think, since air resists the measurement of lengths and breadths. All this contributes to the sense that the marvellous blent air of the church is distinct and ultimately irreplaceable. When we enter a church, we feel the weight of this history around us. There is a rarefied atmosphere to this serious house, which allows us to ask questions about loss and meaning that the emotionally inarticulate caricature of the man next door can't usually ask. It's a place where people came to be serious and think beyond themselves. It seems to me that many of Larkin's poems play off this relationship between the temporal and the eternal, where momentary realizations give way to long perspectives. He often describes the impulse to seek out environments in which the individual escapes the bounds of the wry quotidian self and instead becomes representative of the whole. This could take place in church as a space designated for contemplation of the infinite, but even in secular instances, his verse puts the acutely local in dialogue with the eternal elements of our behaviour, and I take this wording from The Dance, a poem Larkin wrote in 1963 about seeing Maeve Brennan at a workplace dance. Larkin expresses this desire for self-transcendence, or rather self-transfiguration, the individual becoming part of something more universal, in numerous poems. We might think about the young dancers solemnly caught on the beat of happiness in Reasons for Attendance, or the transcendental music in For Sidney Bechet, where jazz falls on the listener as they say love should, like an enormous yes. Larkin is famous for moments of uplift, which transcend and transform the rest of the poem. His poetry is often full of landscaped detail, featuring fairly high-frequency language but used in unusual constructions, and ends on an unexpectedly poignant note, blending the prosaic with sudden lyricism. He tends to localize the scene and anchor the poem in empirical observation, but then, as Kingsley Amis described it, what a dizzying swoop into the midst of most things that matter. It is no coincidence that Larkin turned to religious sentiment in order to explore this interaction with the infinite or eternal. Even when Larkin does not invoke religion, however, his transcendence and endings have something of a religious attitude. The speaker looks up to the sky and realizes his own insignificance. He expresses man's perennial desire to go beyond himself and experience a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain.